Whether you've just started teaching or spent decades in the classroom, you know there's always more to learn. But where do you start? Well, here at Hillsdale College, we have the answer for you. Tried and True, a primer on sound pedagogy by Hillsdale College professor Daniel Copeland. In this little book, you'll read lessons from more than 25 years of Dr. Copeland's classroom experience. It's all distilled into 14 easy-to-read chapters on lesson planning, assignments, and classroom management, and it will help you improve your skills and inspire you as a teacher, one of our most important professions. Whether you've been in front of the classroom for years, or this is your first year, when you read Tried and True, you'll find something to help you keep improving every single day. You don't need to go at it alone. Let Dr. Copeland's real-world experience encourage you and inspire you. You can get your copy today at hillsdale.edu/true. That's hillsdale.edu/TRUE. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We continue our series of episodes from presentations delivered at the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminar on the art of teaching children's literature. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence is an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office. It offers seminars in classical academics and pedagogy for teachers nationwide of any background. Seminars are led by the faculty, leadership, and master teachers of Hillsdale College. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series of events on the art of teaching. From February 29th through March 1st of 2024 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, it's the Art of Teaching, the Sciences. And from April 11th through the 12th in Ann Arbor, Michigan, it's the Art of Teaching, American History. To learn more and register, please visit the webpage for the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence at k12.hillsdale.edu and click on the Events tab to look for the Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. In September of 2023, Dr. Benjamin Beier, Associate Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, spoke to a gathering of teachers and school leaders in an address titled From Nursery Rhymes to Ever After, Some Good Books for Children and the Childlike. Here's part of that presentation.
I'm going to talk to you about nursery rhymes this morning, but it's going to take me a little while to actually get to the nursery rhyme. I think we have to build a little bit of a foundation to stand on to really look at nursery rhymes aright. Some of the things that I'll say I think are going to be more developed in some of the other talks across the day, so that I'll be happy to return in the question period if you wish, but pass fairly quickly through some things that at least apparently aren't explicitly about nursery rhymes, and then get on to the real good stuff of Mother Goose. So you can see at the top of your handout there's a quotation from Plato, always a good place to start. He says, or rather his Socrates in the dialogue The Republic says, "The beginning is the most important part of every work, and this is especially so with anything young and tender, for at that stage it's most plastic, and each thing assimilates itself to the model whose stamp anyone wishes to give it." What is Socrates saying here? What is he up to when he says that the beginning is most important? Right? Kindergarten teachers here, sit up a little straighter. Feel proud. Socrates says you're doing the most important work. Well, there's something about when we receive what Plato calls music, which I think would include story and song. I mean, really almost just kind of all media, all culture. When we receive that and are young, we haven't yet reached the age of reason where we can think things through. Well, we're already being sort of shaped and stamped by those artifacts, those stories that we hear. They're going to be put into our memory. And I really like this word stamp that Socrates uses. In the Greek, it seems to evoke the notion of the signet ring impressing the wax, right? So that it goes into the hot wax really easily, and then what is left hardens and can't really be defaced without great care and effort. So our children receive stories that they're going to hold in their souls, hold in their imaginations and memories, whether they like it or not. So, for instance, this week, I don't know, walking down the street, and I start to hum, the stupidest song, a song that I just despise. Why would that come to mind? Because I heard that song over and over and over in my childhood. And now, right, without seeking to stir it up, without realizing I'm thinking of it, I'm humming it as I walk down the street. So there is this sort of, before we can think about how we're being impressed, we're being impressed. I think, right, stories are doing that. And just to maybe reiterate what Mr. Kuykendall was saying in the opening remarks this morning, what a great gift to be stamped, to be impressed in childhood with the best sorts of stories, so that, a child become adult is in a moment that calls for courageous action. And, it's one thing to have been told, thou shalt not be cowardly or foolhardy, but in the actual press of the moment, the drama of the moment, even if you're disposed to agree, right? Like, you should not be cowardly, even if you want to not be cowardly, probably knowing the command, the dictum is not often going to be sufficient to help us make the best choice. That then, right, we make the choice and we start to develop habits, and it becomes sort of a mark of character over time. But if you both know, right, thou shalt not be cowardly, and you can call upon some of these stories, these images deeply impressed in your imagination, that you can sort of, I'm imitating the courageous action of Horatius that I read about all those many years ago, or that was told to me as a story in second grade, or whatever the case may be, right? Now you're using both your lungs, right? Now you don't just have the sort of intellectual idea, be courageous, but you've got this sort of more emotional, affective series of images of things to imitate, things not to imitate. So it's really important for our future what sort of things we stamp into youths with story. So I keep saying, what sorts of things? Well, now let's talk about, right, the different sorts of stories, the different types of stories. What do we have? And so I have this peculiar little chart picture here where I want to divide up story, literature. So when I say literature there, I'm not thinking of, so we could say literature to mean anything that is written with letters. Sort of the phrase man of letters evokes knowledge of history and oratory and ethics and all sorts of things. Not more narrowly here, literature meaning the objects of study in English departments. Stories, poems, narratives, fictive stuff. So we could divide that literature, I would suggest, into four categories or four parts. The first one of those four that I want to mention is what I've labeled junk. So there are some stories that are junk. And here with the label junk, I'm trying to evoke junk food, because I enjoy junk food. I don't know about you, but it's my belief that junk food eaten in moderation is not a bad thing. I hope that's true because that's how I eat. Well, that's actually to suggest I only eat it in moderation, and that may not be true. So some stories, they're just kind of fluffy, they're ephemeral, there's not much there, but there's something about them that is pleasurable, that's pleasant, that we enjoy it, but it's not a deep or lasting pleasure, right? There's plenty of stories, plenty of poems that we could call, right, junk food of the soul or the mind. Yeah, I'm sure as teachers, right, you're given free examination copies of books from contemporary children's presses, and oftentimes you might say, this seems pretty insubstantial. I call that junk. There is that which is worse than junk. If we want to continue the food metaphors, we could say there's that which is poisonous, stories that have a way of sort of persuading us that evil is good and good is evil. But I wish to just kind of acknowledge that and set that category aside from our considerations. So there's junk and that which is worse than junk, the poisonous, but then there's the great and the good. Maybe you've encountered this distinction before. John Senior, thinker, teacher of the mid-late 20th century, actually a teacher of Dr. David Whalen, who's going to speak later on this afternoon, made this distinction, not just talking about literature. He said there's the 100 great books and the 1,000 good books. And so I want to then sort of take that distinction and think about it just with respect to stories. So great stories, great literature has sort of, bears wisdom, interrogates big and difficult and complex questions through story, through rhyme, perhaps. But the great work of literature is difficult. There's a barrier to entry. It takes a great deal of study and time and effort, right? So James Joyce's Ulysses, Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. Interestingly, all of those are of about the same time period, right? But those are great works, right? Wisdom-bearing artifacts, but really, really tough to wrap our minds around. Really requires study to get at. So that's the great. But then there's the good. And we could say that the good sort of takes the best of junk and great and marries it together. So the good story is just a good story, right? Like there's not a high barrier to entry. There's an immediacy. There's an accessibility. It's just the novel. You want to pick it back up. You want to keep going. So it has the pleasures of junk in some respect. I would suggest actually more profound pleasures, deeper pleasures. That is, good literature delights, but it also instructs. It's also wisdom-bearing. It also has some sort of, formative way of forming our intellects and our wills, our hearts and our minds. It's not merely the pleasant. And so I think there's probably a lot more good works of literature than great works of literature. And it isn't simply that good works are the pathway to the great. I mean, that may actually also be true. And that's interesting that if we give our kids good works, maybe that's a preparation to encounter the great well later on. But I don't wish to instrumentalize good literature. Rather, like, it's good, and that's more than enough, right? The good is excellent, albeit not great in the way that we've been talking about greatness in its blending of delight and instruction. But by the way, it's the Roman poet Horace who talks about literature as blending instruction and delighting. And I'm going to use that phrase frequently. So there's good literature. Now, not all good literature is children's literature, and not all children's literature is good. But if we're trying to work our way towards the nursery rhyme here, I'd say among good literature, good stories, good poems, there is sort of a subcategory of those children's stories that are classic children's literature. is a subgroup of good literature. But based on what I've said so far about the good and this label of classic children's literature, I think we might be liable to misunderstand what makes for a classic of children's literature. So I want to briefly just note, we could say three marks of a children's classic, or three marks of classic children's lit that's more or less true of all classics of children's literature and helps us better understand what is a classic of children's literature, a good work of kids books. First of all, I've used the modifier classic, and you can see there on your handout. I mean, we are really flying through this talk. We're about an inch down on the front of the page. You can see there on the handout, our word classic in English comes from the Latin classicus, which one of its meanings is of the highest order, or the highest rank, that which is superior. So that sense of classicus comes into English in our use of the word class to talk about social class. So children's literature that's good is classic. It's of the highest order. But a couple thoughts about that. First of all, right, classic of the highest order doesn't mean antique, right? It's not sort of the classic car is the 1934 Ford, right? It's the old thing. The four-door, the suicide doors, 34 Ford. We're kind of close to Detroit. I'm not from Michigan originally. It's exciting to me to be talking about this right now. Anyhow, right? It's classic sometimes we use to mean old, right? Classics of children's literature don't have to be old. Sure, some, right, stand the test of time, and that can be a mark that there really is an excellence, that they're not just sort of a moment, poof, and then gone. But it could be that a classic of children's literature isn't old. And in fact, it's not, a static closed list, like here are the classics of children's literature, and there will never be anything added to the list. Go read them to your students and have them at your hearth at home, right? It's a more dynamic thing, which I think is actually beautiful and encouraging to authors and artists and readers, that, it could be that, that Frog and Toad or The Seven Silly Eaters or something is the next classic, or the next classic is actually to be thought up next week by an artist we've never heard of. That dynamism is important to see, that classics of children's literature aren't just old and thereby maybe, in some people's views, stuffy and inaccessible. Okay. Also, second mark of a classic of children's literature, it's not enjoyed just by children. This great quotation from C.S. Lewis there on the handout, a children's story which is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story. To be fair to Lewis, he actually qualifies that remark in context, and I've taken it out of context. But I think he's right. So children's literature is indeed especially accessible to children, but not to be hated or dreaded by the adult who's reading it to the child. And also, right, just the fact that the adult likes it reveals some of the depth in the classic work of children's literature. That it's something that you maybe first encountered as a kid, you wish to return to it, you wish to share it with your kids. It has some sort of depth where when you read it a second time, read it at a different moment in your life, it gives you something more, it gives you something different. So kids' books are indeed accessible to kids, but also good for the childlike of all ages. The title, mentions good books for the children and the childlike. So maybe the junk food children's book is childish and not to be enjoyed by adults, but the classic of children's literature is for the child and the childlike, admits sort of many readings over time that can be helpful to the reader or the hearer. Lewis goes on to think about this a little bit more. How is it that children's books that are good are enjoyed by adults and children? And he's thinking about it from the perspective of being an author, right? He himself having written the Chronicles of Narnia. And he says, I myself, sometimes when I write a children's story, because a children's story is the best art form for the thing I have to say. So when you're inspired by the muses as an artist, You don't say sort of, now hold on here, like, could I please receive this inspiration in a form fitted to, right, the novel where I can win the American Book Award and the Pulitzer? And so, but sometimes, right, the genre of children's literature is the fitting thing for the idea that the author has. And that, again, kind of, I think, can help us account for how great classic children's books are enjoyed by children and adults. Finally, I've beat this drum of the good book providing instruction as well as delight. I think it's quite possible we could mishear that or not really get what it means. Again, Mr. Kuykendall has already sort of anticipated what I wanted to say in the quotation he offered from Vigen Groyen's book, right? So to say that a children's story or any good work of literature instructs, right, doesn't mean that it's sentimentalizing, doesn't mean that it's moralizing. It's not sort of, thou shalt not do this. It's not, necessarily a morality play where it's sort of like, clearly, this figure is all good, this figure is all bad. It's not that at all. In fact, right, children's works that are moralizing aren't good. Think for yourself, if you're old enough, about Looney Tunes, right? Just how enjoyable, how wonderful. And now think about, the PBS Kids program that you're most exposed to for one reason or another. I like some PBS Kids programming. I think some of it's pretty decent. But a lot of the PBS Kids programming, right, is pedantic as can be, right? Like, the whole point of this cartoon is to get you to thou shalt recycle, which is apparently the only thing that we can say and hold in common as a society. Thou shalt recycle, which is, again, a worthy thing to do, but I wish we held more in common as a people. So Looney Tunes held up against that is just play, right? I mean, of course, right? Looney Tunes is doing some instructing, saying things like, hey, guess what? The Barber of Seville is really awesome. And if you've never seen The Rabbit of Seville, you need to go on YouTube as soon as this is over and check it out. But, right, so it's to say that classic children's lit instructs is not to say that it's pedantic or simplistic. Just, I put the picture of Peter Rabbit there. I think for those of you who know that story from Beatrix Potter, it's an example of what Lewis calls, right, a moral rising from spiritual roots of the author, right? So it's not the Beatrix Potter story. You ought not be like Peter Rabbit. In fact, I think some of us kind of forget that Peter Rabbit is naughty. We've got so many teacups and coloring books and T-shirts and things that we've kind of disengaged Peter from the story, wherein, right, not at all in a sort of finger-pointing way, Beatrix Potter shows sort of, well, Peter breaks and enters, and then he's gluttonous, stuffs himself full, and then he's accused of theft, not by the narrator, but by the owner of the property. And then, right, he could escape under the gate, except the natural consequence of his gluttony is that he won't fit under the gate anymore. And then at home even, right, mother's not too upset with him. It's just kind of, oh, Peter lost his jacket again. But this gentle comparison of Peter with his siblings, Peter gets sent to bed because he's tired out from all his sinning, and the siblings get to enjoy a delicious supper, right? So there's all sorts of instruction in there without it. Right? Don't be naughty like this, Peter, right? It's not. So I think that's just a good way to sort of understand what I mean by a classic children's work being instructive. Doesn't mean it's pedantic.
That was Dr. Benjamin Beier, Associate Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, and his address, From Nursery Rhymes to Ever After, Some Good Books for Children and the Childlike. To learn more about the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence and register for future events, please visit the webpage for the Hoogland Center at k12.hillsdale.edu, then click the Events tab and look for Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.